viewers. Welcome to this lecture entitled Qualitative Approach Towards Environmental Sociology. Qualitative approach is one of the most interesting and most effective ways of understanding environmental sociology. Now, in case of environmental sociology, the methodical approaches include qualitative, quantitative, integrative, spatial, and policy analysis. Now, qualitative approaches basically has the more advantage as compared to the other because it allows for more diversity in responses as well as the capacity to adapt to the new developments or issues during the research process itself. While qualitative analysis of the data can be more time consuming and at the same time expensive, many fields of research employ qualitative techniques that have been specifically developed to provide more cost efficient and timely results. There are certain things which are needed to be kept in mind while conducting a qualitative analysis of the data. The first one being that qualitative data should be selected more purposefully according to whether or not they typify certain characteristics or contextual locations. The second, the role of this research scholar or the researcher in qualitative data analysis is very, very critical. This is because in qualitative data analysis, the possibility of the researcher taking a neutral or transcendental position is seen to be more problematic in practical or in philosophical terms. Hence, qualitative researchers are often exhorted to reflect on their role during the research process and to make their analysis more and more clear. The third thing which needs to be kept in mind while doing the qualitative data analysis is that it can take place in a wide variety of forms which it tends to differ from quantitative research in the focus of language, sign and meanings as well as approaches to analyze that they are holistic and contextual rather than reductionist and isolationist. So while doing this qualitative data analysis, it is very important to focus what kind of science, what kind of language is being used, because in case of quantitative, all what matters is the numbers that we get, the quantitative aspect of it. But in qualitative, which is based more upon the surveys, the kind of reports that we get, the kind of language and their analysis is equally important. Then, the systematic and transparent approaches to the analysis of the qualitative data are almost regarded as the most essential part of it. Perhaps the most traditional division in the way of qualitative and quantitative research has been used in the social science, whereby focus is given more to the kind of approach, to the kind of answers which are being given, to the kind of feelings which are being addressed during any kind of survey which are being done during the qualitative data analysis. Then, the three most important areas which are a part of inherent environmental sociology or which are inherent to environmental sociology include material, ideological, and solution-based approaches. The material includes consumerism, technology, infrastructure, and population pressures. The ideological path approaches normative values like the economics of endless growth, the practice of consumption as a virtue, individualism versus collectivism, and how cultural beliefs and experience affect perceptions of environment. And finally, the solution-based approaches turns to study the socio-environmental problems and the ways in which the reforms can be made and standardized so as to give an effective solution to the kind of problems which are existing within the environment. So, basically, in this particular lecture, the learning objectives include to identify the epistemological and the common ground differences between the natural science research and sociological approaches and perspectives. Second one being to understand and apply the perspectives in sociology to specific environmental challenges. The third one being to inspect how sociology can help us analyze the environmental injustice from micro to the macro to the integrative levels, and finally to illustrate how sociology creates actionable scenarios and narratives to reform unsustainable and unjust practices as a part of the environment. Now, coming to the classical sociological canons, which are the basis for any kind of a sociologist to deal with, are certain theories of Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emily Durkheim. Karl Marx relied on particular understanding of historical materialism and the laws of history, whereby Max Weber gave emphasis on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which was a critique of Marx's historical materialism to argue that the material conditions which are required to fuel capitalism are not enough, and that capitalism also requires ideological formulations to help create the conditions needed for the complete transition from feudalism to capitalism. And finally, in case of Emily Durkheim, emphasis is being given upon the transition which has happened from the traditionalism to the modern society. So, keeping these views in mind, whereby capitalism was a very, very major concept during the era where the theories were being laid down, keeping that in mind, the new concept of eco-capitalism has come up, whereby eco-capitalism is also known as the environmental capitalism, and or rather the green capitalism, whereby the view is that the capital exists in nature as the natural capital on which all the wealth depends. Therefore, governments should use market-based policy instruments to resolve environmental problems. The other part of this quality-based approach towards environmental sociology involves the constructivist theory, which has a partition between the agnostic approach as well as the pragmatic approach. Now, in case of agnosticism or the agnostic approach, the supporters of this particular view, they are completely reluctant to employ any kind of scientific indicators of the phenomena which are happening, and instead they prefer to problematize, contextualize, and sometimes deconstruct scientific evidence regarding issues such as anthropogenic climate change. On the contrary, the pragmatic approach, or the people who support the pragmatic approach, they depend upon the available scientific data, and which is actually based on wide range of environmental conditions. And also they look about the factors above the data, about the scientific varieties of it, and try to analyze how scientific they are. And depending upon its scientific aptitude, they give their views. The agnosticism about the state of environmental conditions that has its roots in the postmodernist turn of the larger discipline and the popularity of the constructivist analyst within the environmental sociology was so prevalent in the year 1990s that it continues to have pervasive effects on sociological research and theorizing about societal environmental relationships. This is particularly true amongst the European scholars, where there is far less work on the material dimensions of environmental problems, which is very, very notable in the kind of work that has happened. Now, coming to the sociological perspectives on environment, which has a qualitative agenda as well, The first one being the realist approach. Now, in case of the realist approach, they think that whatever is happening is very, very real as in terms to the world society. The problems of the environment are quite real, and inevitably the social scientists will actually follow the lead of natural sciences in identifying the problems and also try to know about the solutions which are affecting the environment. And also they would look after what kind of alternatives are actually present which could make the environment a better place to stay in. And in this approach, the sociobiologists are in the same boat as that of the most other commentators on environmental problems. And also in case of academics as well as many disciplines, for example, the environmental scientists, the economists, and the psychologists, they argue about what kind of problems are already existing and what can be done. Now, just on the contrary, if the sociology has to work, or if the sociological perspective is actually looking towards it, the mere difference or the fine line of difference between the work, what the environmentalists do, and what the sociologists are doing is that in case of the environmental sociology, they look towards a more deeper and a more systematic understanding of the social roots of the environmental problems and the process of the social change. Now, coming to the second approach, which is the constructionist approach. In case of constructionist approach, they basically attack the realism, and their views are rather completely different to what the realists believe. So they argue that there is no one reality of environmental problems because there are multiple environmental problems. The people have different views and beliefs of the kind of origin of environmental problems. So there can't be one solution to any of these environmental problems. And the second perspective comes from a sociological tradition which says that society is not a real thing. It is socially constructed, and therefore in this view, social and other realities, they do not exist independently of the meanings the people create about them. So sociologists should actually try and investigate how the environment is being understood by the different sections of the population, how the environmental issues are constituted as social problems, and how people are trying to respond and cope up with the problems which are existing in nature. The third approach being the reformist approach. Now, in case of reformist approach, they actually try to make certain small reforms or find out solutions to the existing environmental problems. And they try to make changes within the economic and political structures of the current society to deal with the environmental problems. Now, one of the must-read books which should be read by the people who are actually a part of studying environmental sociology is the book on natural capitalism. Within this approach, the markets are the main means to distribute the products, and the products are bought and sold only for money. And according to Hawken and his colleagues, natural capitalism does not aim to discard market economics. Instead, what they do is that there is a necessity for steering of markets in more creative and constructivist directions. Other aspects of the capitalist economy include money, private ownership of the means of production, and wage labor are also retained. The qualitative tradition in United States is usually seen as consisting of three or more or less chronologically distinct but overlapping phases, which includes interactionism, symbolic interactionism, and finally ethnomethodology. Keeping these particular points in mind, the first quiz is: ethnography does not include, the options are field notes, objective analysis, participant observation, and value neutrality. Yes, you're right. The answer to this particular question is objective analysis. next part of the lecture, we would deal with the other qualitative aspects of environmental sociology, the first one being positivism. Now, in case of positivism, there is emphasis which is given to the relation between causes and effects, the experimental research or objectively controlled forms, which is reductionist in its approach, and its emphasis is being given upon the few variables and parsimony knowledge which is being generated by careful observation and measurement of objective reality. The researcher checks with theory and with the reality. The next part of it being the constructivism, whereby the researcher actually looks for complexity of meanings and they actually narrow down the meanings in few categories rather than strong reliance on participants' views, and interactive constructivism or interactive construction of meanings. The researcher also constructs theory from observation of meaning constructions by social actors. The third part being the critical approach towards social reality, whereby the emphasis is given on exposing the social reality as oppressive for marginalized groups. There is thus an explicit normative touch to critical theory in that it advocates an action agenda for political reforms. And specific issues are addressed such as empowerment, inequality, domination, oppression, and alienation. And finally, the most important theory being the pragmatism or the pragmatic views, whereby the emphasis in social research is on what works and on solutions to that of the problems. Pragmatist research is thus neither confined to objectivity or to meaning constructivism, but refers to both when appropriate in dealing with the research questions. Now, regarding the pragmatists, there is a lot of beliefs, like the kind of views they have, the kind of versions they have in their approach is completely different from that of the people who have the vision of realism or constructivism. So they sort of alienate themselves from the theories which supports realism and constructivism. The pragmatists are basically interested in immediate and tangible results of the knowledge. As such, they don't necessarily align to either realism or optimism. A pragmatist may view realists as overthinkers and optimists as too detached from immediate concerns. But there are certain grey areas while concerning the pragmatists, whereby these pragmatists are often interested in partial truths, which have very few applications in the present day scenarios. And a pragmatist can actually consider something to be true without needing to confirm that it is universally a true fact or not. So they are neither inclined towards the concepts which the realists believe, nor towards the concepts which the constructivists believe. Now, there are two theories based upon this particular fact. One is the correspondence theory of truth, whereby a particular theory is considered to be a fact if it accurately describes the world. And this is prone to errors such as confusing more correlation with causation. And however, it is useful to approach knowledge validation that is commonly used by the pragmatists. So in this particular part of this correspondence theory of truth, if a particular fact describes accurately the world, they can be referred to as corresponding to the truth. But while considering these kinds of truths, it is probable that there can be more amount of errors. On the contrary, the coherence theory of truth is a fact whereby the philosophers believe, or they have been the intent, that whereby they find out what the facts are and then they inquire what belief is most in harmony with their system. And this particular quote was being given by Charles Sanders Peirce, whereby they believe on the world facts and the kind of belief which exists in harmony with the system. So, keeping these views in mind, the next quiz for this particular section is, the question goes as such, whereby utility and change are the basic principles of, the options are realism, naturalism, pragmatism, and idealism. Yes, you're right. The answer to this particular question is pragmatism. Coming to the sociological issues in environmental research and education, there was a certain set of points which were being given by the sociologists to National Science Foundation, or what is known as NSF. Basically, the environmental sociologists are working day in and day out to find out problems which are related to the society and are trying to address these issues at the grassroots levels. But while addressing these issues and while finding out the problems, they have come across various kinds of points or various kinds of informations which needs to be addressed, especially to the National Science Foundation. Some of the points include that they are actually fighting for issues whereby, or rather the problems which have direct impacts upon the environment. And these impacts of environmental change basically affect the diverse populations differentially as a function of racial, ethnic, gender, and economic status. Using disaster research as a guide, people disproportionately suffer the effects of environmental change. And NSF, or National Science Foundation, basically needs to sponsor extensive research on this. Then, coming to the second point, whereby the joint organizations, which includes the NSF, have a decision-making body referred to as the Decision-Making and Valuation for Environmental Policy, shortly referred to as DMVEP, whereby the entire grants for the programs should be expanded and also explained. And also for the same fact, valuation is a primary emphasis with the coupled human and natural systems area. And DMVEP program has been the source of important new research in the measurement of human values. The third point is that although it is a positive and hopeful development that human health and environment is another of the four primary emphasis with coupled human and natural systems area, but more emphasis should be given upon how these kind of environmental problems with sustainable solutions can be addressed. And the final one being that NSF envisions in basically the cyber informatics or the cyber infrastructure. So keeping that in mind, from the census data to longitudinal surveys, the high quality data which is being received from these areas should be combined with that of the ecologists, the geographers, and the others who have the potential for yielding provocative insights regarding both the causes and the effects of environmental change. Now, the other aspects of NSF basically involves the means of getting positive environmental change is through education. Education is something very primary, but one of the most important agents or agenda that is a part of it. Without prior education, without prior understanding of these kinds of problems, it is not possible to address them and at the same time solve these issues. So more emphasis needs to be given on elementary education, and that is what NSF exactly does. NSF has research which, or rather more emphasis upon the research on which kind of curriculum has the greatest impact on environmental education. And NSF should also actually explore how it can be done more explicitly in curbing the environmental abuse. So education which actually focuses on curbing the environmental abuses, on curbing the kind of abuse which is happening to the animals as well as to the biodiversity, which is creating more and more environmental problems, should be something which should be more focused on. Environmental sociology, apart from NSF, also is being dominated by certain macro sociological theories. But out of these macro sociological theories, it is the micro sociological theories that is gaining more and more importance day by day. And of course, these micro sociological theories cannot be ignored, neither can they be neglected. In this particular micro sociological theory, from the symbolic interactionism to actor network theory, from dramaturgy to conversation analysis, from practice theory to animism, a variety of macro sociological perspectives are not only drawn but creatively applied and developed, making this collection not only a contribution to environmental sociology but to micro sociological theory as well. The authors which are a part of these micro sociological theory, they actually address certain topics which are small, but they hold the most important area of the sociological aspect, which includes the treatment of wastes, human-animal relationships, science and industry partnerships, environmental society movements, identities and lifestyles, followed by other aspects of ecotourism, framing of land, water and natural resources, and even human conceptions of outer space. Microsociology exists both as an umbrella term for perspectives which focus on agency, such as the Max Weber's theory of social action, and as a body of distinct techniques, particularly in American sociology. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying that in case of qualitative analysis or qualitative aspects of environmental sociology, although it is time consuming, there is more amount of expenditure which has been involved, but since a variety of responses can actually be received from the qualitative analysis, it is one of the best ways to understand the societal problems and also go to the root causes of these problems and also find a definitive solution to this particular existing issue. So, keeping these factors in mind, the next quiz for this particular lecture involves the study of human behavior in context of face-to-face interaction is also known as, the options are macrosociology, microsociology, traditional study, and modern study. Yes, you're right. The answer to this particular question is microsociology. Thank you.